On this episode of Full Bore, we start putting together the B Series engine out of my BJ40 LandCruiser. Let's get cruising. After a bit of a hiatus on the 40 series rebuild, we're back at it again, and this time we're looking at the motor. If you've been watching a few of the previous episodes, you will know that somebody's given this motor a bit of a tickle up in the past, a bit of a freshen up, and chucked a new set of cam bearings in it. Now unfortunately they put the cam bearings in without aligning the oil holes, which kind of sucked because it meant that my cam wasn't being fed any oil from the oil pump. But looks like we got to it in time, and the cam is actually still in pretty good nick. Now, what I actually did was ordered a set of cam bearings. When I was plugging it into the part system, I just went 1978 BJ40 LandCruiser, buy me a set of cam bearings. And when I got the pack, there were only 3 bearings in it. Now this block actually has 5 cam bearings. So what that made me realize is that in the earlier B series engines that only run 3 bearings. In the later ones, I think it's around about potentially 82 onwards, they went to 5 bearings. So this means that this engine is most definitely not the engine that came out with that particular LandCruiser. Now, hey, that's not a bad thing. I would have liked it to have been matching numbers, but that's not what this build's about. It's about enjoying an old classic out on the tracks, and if it's all matching numbers and concourse, then you just don't want to do that, do you? Well, managed to get my hands on a set of Tahoe bearings. Actually came with 5 in this pack, which is exactly what we want. And of course, then I had to track myself down a cam bearing insert tool, which takes shape in this bar with this sort of metal cone on it, and I'll show you how to boofska that in just a second. So we'll get cracking, remove these old bearings, and we'll see if we can get ourselves into a spot of trouble, hey? Now, this particular cam bearing tool, she's a bit old school. It's essentially just a steel bar with a cone on it, so it sort of centralizes itself in the cam tunnel. Now, the way that this one works, you've got these metal dies that have been made up to fit specific cam bearing sizes. Just plonk that on there, just grab your cam bearing, put that over the top, and then bash it in. I've got a few cam bearings left in there. All I've had to do is find a die that I can plonk on the end that just picks up the lip of the actual bearing itself without picking up the gusset in the tunnel, and that way I can just punch the old cam bearing through. That's it. So that appears to be the right die. I'll just slip that in there. The cam bearing tool in. Bob's your uncle. It's amazing that these cam bearings are still in fairly good condition. It's funny, they probably haven't been in here for too long, but they kind of seem to have the wear of an engine that's probably got, you know, about 100,000 Ks on it or thereabouts. It's actually picked up some metal, so it would be interesting to know exactly how long this engine's been running without oil feed to it. Of course, if it had run for too long, it would have just failed catastrophically, but hey, we'll get there in the end. All the cam bearings are out of it. What I've had to do is actually bash out the cam bearing tunnel Welsh plug, which resides in the rear of the engine between the back of the block and the gearbox. And that's to allow me to bash that last cam bearing all the way through. So I will have to replace that Welsh plug. Now it's just a matter of cleaning it all up. The next part is sort of probably the trickiest, and the reason being is that you really want to get those oil feed holes lined up. As you can see, each bearing is numbered. Now it's pretty important to get each of those bearings into its corresponding journal in the block, and the reason being is that the journals actually generally start out as a larger journal at the front of the block and then progressively get smaller towards the rear. Got this bearing marked out here ready to go into the cam tunnel. Now I'm lucky in that the actual oil feed hole in the bearing is a fair bit larger than the oil feed hole in the tunnel, so it just gives me a little bit more tolerance if I just don't have it perfectly aligned, but it should be pretty alright. Also really important that the journal in the cam tunnel itself is really clean. Because these are an interference fit, when you go to punch them in, if there's a bit of schmutz, it can actually close up the tolerance between the bearing and your cam, and sometimes that's all it takes on finer tolerance engines to sort of wreck your day, because it can pick up a bit of metal and sort of gack your cam a little bit. As each bearing is punched into place, I double check to make sure that that oil gallery hole is definitely aligned with the hole in the block. Now what I've actually done is left the first bearing for last, and the reason being is that it's very difficult to drive in the first bearing at the right angle when you can't use that location cone on the bearing tool. So what I've actually got to do is take the engine off the stand so I can access the front bearing from the back of the engine. Okay, so the front bearing in the block is a little bit different to the rest in that in the journal there's actually two oil holes. One which leads in from the main bearing here, and then one that leads out to the deck of the block and presumably into the head to feed all the rocker gear and stuff. That's my deduction. I'm not a professional on this, but essentially what that means is that I have to line up both of the bearing oil holes with said holes in the block. So it just means that you don't just have to line up the one, you can actually accidentally line up one oil hole and completely block off the other one. So that's just a bit of something to look out for. So the cam bearings are back in the block. I was pretty happy with how well that all went, considering that I'm not an engine rebuilding professional, but one of the last things I went and done was to grab the cam and chuck it in the block to see whether or not it spins over freely. So done that, and I found that the rear bearing actually was causing a little bit of resistance, making the cam a little bit hard to spin around, which isn't really what you want to see, because potentially if you've got too much bind, it'll pick up a bit of metal and can potentially spin that cam bearing and causing it to block off the oil hole once again, which is exactly not what you want to happen. Now all I did was spun it a little bit. It left a bit of a witness mark in the particular binding spot on the bearing, and I just rubbed it down with some super duper fine emery paper. Probably not the professional thing to do, but hey, for this old beast, it's going to do me fine. Now, probably not like a uber professional thing, as I said, but I'm going to wash that particular area down really well to make sure none of that emery residue is left in that particular section of the engine, because that's the sort of stuff that'll wear things super duper quick. Now, hey, the block's pretty well ready to have everything chucked back in it, and you'll probably see that in one of the upcoming episodes of Full Bore, where I go to the trouble of putting this bad boy right back together. So hopefully we can get this 40 series project really cracking along. Anyway, that concludes this short episode of Full Bore. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to click that subscribe button, and we'll catch you on an upcoming episode of this channel, which is of course Full Bore. Keep cruising, my dudes.